angry at her in the moment. I didn't catch anything remorseful about him in the room at all. And I'm not going to say that he was happy he did it, but he seemed resolved that he did it. And that he gave me the impression that he felt like this was 100% necessary because he had thought that she was seeing somebody else.
Warning. The podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent assaults, murder, and adult language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Kecia Hughes, Part 2. Welcome back, listeners. David, when we left off last time, you were about to do the interview with the suspect, and you mentioned something that was in his pocket that Officer Lynn had found. What can you tell us was in his pocket?
Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but I thought about this before we sat down to record it, and I thought, what I need to do is probably talk about all the things going on while somebody's in the interview room. Because remember I said this was a unique case in that the patrol just brings a suspect in. And there's not a whole lot we know. So there's a lot of things going on. And I think that's one thing I want people to understand is that, again, we've said it time and time again, no one person investigates one of these cases. It's a big team effort. And there was a lot of team effort going on with that.
Well, and I'm certainly one for details. So why don't you tell us what was going on?
Well, for example, before I went in, and I'm trying to gather what little information we had about this before I went in with the suspect, in the background what's happening is the forensics unit is arriving on the scene, and they're starting to kind of get an idea of what they've got to work with. But what's important with that is that the forensics unit can't go in and process the scene. We've all seen that on TV and on other documentaries and everything, until a search warrant has been asked for and been signed off on and is ready to go. That's a critical thing. So while I'm getting that just a basic scant information I can get, forensics has arrived, and other detectives that I worked with are preparing the search warrants for the apartment and the car that Troy was found in.
So why would one need search warrants? Because it's obviously pretty clear that you have a deceased person that was found in the home. So why would you need a search warrant to go in there?
That's a good question, and that's why I wanted to go into this a little bit, is that we use search warrants because it's the United States. The difference is in us and a bunch of other countries is the law enforcement represents the government. And, we all know a couple hundred years ago we got kind of tired of King George over in England and changed things because over there the government needed nothing to walk into somebody's home, which is one of the reasons people got fed up. Well, here is you get a search warrant, and it's critical because to get into somebody's home in the United States, you have to have probable cause. The correct method of doing that is through a search warrant, which is where an officer prepares what's called an affidavit, which has details on it, and takes it to a judge and gets it sworn into, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. The big thing is that there's some exceptions to the search warrant thing that can come up. And occasionally you'll have murder cases that, on the face of it, may meet an exception or appear to in the beginning. For example, if you go into a scene and everything this scene speaks to you is that the decedent in there is the only person that lives in that house, the only person that stays in that house, you could probably start to work around that a little bit because there's nobody to give consent or anything, but it's really dangerous water to go to. In the United States, under the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, a warrant is required based on probable cause. Now, there's a few exceptions to that, but they're very particular and they have to meet certain standards. For example, you can have a search incident to a lawful arrest where, like, the police enter a home to make an arrest, they have a warrant for the arrest or probable cause, and they can search the immediate area around the arrest, but they can't go any further than that. And that's based on looking for things like weapons or possibly any evidence that was discarded right there in that immediate area. Another way is based on plain sight. For example, if the police are already lawfully in a place, we're going to get consent in a minute. So if the police if a homeowner or a person that has the expectation of privacy in the home invites the police in, and you're standing there and you see something in plain sight, you can seize that and get probable cause and get a warrant to go further. So that's there too. Another method to get inside of a home is through consent. And then that's basically what it sounds like is the police say, may I come in? And the homeowner or the person that has the expectation of privacy there says yes or no. There's also things like there's exceptions to automobiles. Automobiles take a little bit less if they're actually out on the road because of the idea that people can move around and people who work with other people can move around like co-suspects. So it's more of a rush search in that. And if the car is not towed, usually you can search it there too. Now, the last one is what a lot of people hear about is what we call exigent circumstances or hot pursuit. And what that is if there's something that the police can articulate accurately that someone in that home is in danger or the police are following somebody while they're pursuing him for committing a felony, you can enter that home. But even then, you've got to be really careful about how far you go with those things. And every one of these methods will be carefully scrutinized in court, usually by the defense. So back to my point is that we usually, not usually, but always did what we called cut a paper. If somebody prepared a search warrant affidavit and did that.
So how did you go about obtaining that warrant?
Well, I didn't do it because I was getting ready to go in the room with Troy, but one of the guys I worked with, Craig Sorrell, a detective in the unit at that time, actually stepped up and did that. And what he does is he gets what's called an affidavit, and he puts several things go on the search warrant affidavit. First of all, there has to be a very detailed description of what we want to search. And when I say detailed, it has to be detailed. For example, when we describe an apartment or a house, that description has to be so good that if you or anybody else took that and read that warrant and stood on a street, that you could go to that house, regardless if it had house numbers or not, and not mistake it. That's mission critical on these things. Then it talks about what we're going to ask permission to go in and look for and take. And that's important too. That has to be commensurate with what you're looking for. For example, if you were doing a property crime and you were looking for a 72-inch big screen TV, I'm not going to be able to go inside that apartment based on that information and look inside dresser drawers. It has to fit that. So Craig put that together. And actually for the listeners, if you go to our show notes at murderpolicepodcast.com for this episode, I went ahead and put copies up of the affidavit and the search warrant, and just be ready to redact it a little bit. Everything you get through open records requests is redacted. It's pretty neat. And for example, on this one where Craig did the affidavit for the search warrant, he describes, and I'm going to have to take some things out because they're taken up. It gives it says, here's the address, and it says more particularly described as follows. And it says that, for example, it has the house number, which we're not going to read here, or the apartment number because that's immaterial now. It talks about the color of the sign, that the street numbers are on the sign, where that's located. It's present on the outside of the building, located on the second floor of Building 4 in the southeast corner of the building. The numbers appear and it's got the numbers again, and are affixed to the center of the door. A plastic Christmas ornamentation of Santa Claus is also affixed to the same door. So see what I'm saying is every detail you can provide is really mission critical. So the whole thing is we don't want to hit the wrong door.
Right.
Now, in this case, it's not a big deal because remember, Kecia was found in the apartment. The officers were there. They have the scene secured. There's not going to be a misidentification. But that's what the judges are going to look for. And then it talks about Craig in there starts to talk about the fact that, the real brief thing that an unidentified female had been found deceased in the apartment. And then he goes on to describe the Pontiac car that he was in. And then there's some check boxes or some things that Craig listed on there. For example, what he's asking for is on our affidavit, it says, for the following describe personal property and or physical evidence, to wit, blood, hair, fiber, semen, or other trace evidence, photographs, interior and exterior, weapons, guns, knives, clubs, or other instruments used as a weapon, any ammunition, shell casings, or projectiles, any personal, financial, or other notes, writings, records, or documents that may assist in the investigation of this death. Those sound broad, but they're really not. And keep in mind, too, that when we found Kecia in this moment, we had really no idea how she died. In the big thing on an affidavit in Kentucky, there's some check boxes, and he had checked for property or things used in committing a crime, property or things in the possession of a person who has intention to use, the same as committing a crime, and it goes on further and further with that. Once the officer goes ahead and then finally gives a synopsis, and if you go online, you can read the synopsis that Craig put. I'm not going to read that to everybody. But it's pretty much the story that we've told so far. is what goes in there. Has to be accurate. It's going to get scrutinized. After that, you take that in front of a judge. That can vary. It's pretty interesting how that works. If it's during a Monday through Friday working days, you'll go to the courthouse and ask for an available judge, and they'll kind of work within a schedule to wiggle you in to get in front of a judge. If it's after hours where we are, there's a call-out procedure, and there's a judge on standby somewhere. It's somewhere in the town that you'll wake up at sometimes 3 or 4 in the morning to go to their home and actually swear to a warrant there. It's pretty neat. Basically, you take it, the judge reviews it, they read it over, they may or may not ask questions about it. In some rare cases, they may send you back to get some things clarified because they pay attention to these. They review it, they ask you to raise your right hand, and they actually swear you to the facts on that warrant. That's huge. Your reputation is at stake with this. If you ever bamboozle one of these or mess it up, that judge and some of the other judges probably won't sign warrants for you anymore. After that, they sign it, and that's called a good warrant, and you take it back to the location, and that's when the warrant is served or executed. It's pretty simple after that. Once you've gone through, or in this case forensics goes through, is they make a detailed list of everything that they took, and they leave a copy of that list back where the warrant is served. That's Warrants 101, probably, Search Warrants 101.
So during the time that all this is going on and you've got the warrant being signed, what else is going on with this case while you're in the interview room with Troy?
So much stuff because it just happened so quick. For example, the other investigators on the team they're out helping complete what's called the neighborhood investigation. We've talked about those before. They're speaking to the responding officers again. The responding officers always send in very detailed memos, but speaking to them is mission critical. And they start to track down family and friends for interviews. It's a lot of moving parts because this is all about victimology and who last spoke to her, what was last said, who last saw her. All of that stuff has to come into play and get documented.
Well, you said earlier that these interviews are fortunate to have because you have someone, but difficult because you're going in kind of blind, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I said in the last episode, and it's true. They pull up, they basically say, here we come, and they give you that scant facts. And when you're going in, I think that's what I'm trying to get across, is that you're going to go in this room, you've got one opportunity, you cannot wait all afternoon, you have to exercise this pretty quickly. So you're going to sit down with this person that at this moment you don't even know if they're going to talk to you, but that's the challenge of it. So the thing is, before you get in, you're like a sponge trying to get anything you can get up to that moment of walking into that room.
Okay, so back to what I originally asked you when we picked back up on this second episode. What was found in Troy's pocket?
This is a good time to talk about that. Again, that was a big difference maker because when Officer Ricky Lynn took him into custody, he found a note folded up in his pocket. And it was one of those things that was very fortunate to have going in an interview because it did so much. And if people go again to murderpolicepodcast.com and find the show notes for this episode, I have a scanned copy of a redacted version of that handwritten note that Troy had in his pocket. Let me read it real quick, the parts that aren't redacted. It says, Dear Mary Harris.
Now, wait, who's Mary?
Mary is his mother. Actually.
Okay.
So, good question. That's Troy's mother. So it says, Dear Mary Harris, I'm sorry for doing this, but I love her too much, period. I can't live without her. Tell everyone I love them, Troy Hughes. And then there's kind of like a second paragraph. It says, Mom, Mary Harris, and whatever was in there was redacted. It's not important, but it's taken out. And it says, everything that my wife and I have goes to the kids except for the TV that goes to my mom. And it says Troy, and under it says big screen TV in the front room. Now, when you read that, what does that sound like to you when you read that? What are the things that stand out?
Well, to me, it sounds kind of like either I'm getting ready to kill myself and here's what I want happened, or I'm getting ready to go to jail and here's what I want to happen.
Exactly.
Either way, it's something's about to terminate.
And again, when you read between the lines, when he says everything that my wife and I have goes to the kids, that if you read between the lines on that, that's an admission to some degree that my wife is no longer alive, or he would be leaving it to her and the kids, or say like if he was mad at her for some reason, it don't give anything to Kecia, but it was interesting. So that finding that was a stroke of luck because circumstantially, they'd already put together the idea that this guy more than likely circumstantially, is responsible for her death. But we're still not positive. So, you know what, when you're going in the interview room, you could get some information that changes that. But something like this slides it over the edge considerably and gives you much more confidence in the idea that you're talking to the person that's responsible for this. It also gives the person doing the interview a place to go with that person's mindset. And that can come in handy later. For example, if you need to do scratch to see if you could feel a conscience in this person, which is so rare in that room anyway, but is that you could pull that up. And I ended up talking about it briefly in the interview. But as an investigator coming in on something that fast, that was a huge help when Ricky found that in his pocket. Now,
at this point in the interview, have you read that note? Or do you not know about that note
No,
yet?
I knew about the note going in, that's why I'm saying it was helpful.
Does he know that you know about the note?
No. Yeah, that's the other thing too is, and we've talked before, is that you only provide information that you think is going to tickle responses that you want, and that's important. It's kind of like a card game, is that you're going to hold the cards that you hold until you need to play them to get the effort out of it. So no, he didn't know about that I knew about that note at that time.
Now, did you know that you're going to ask him about it soon, or was that just off the table? You're not even going to inquire about it?
No, I knew that I could, and that I probably would. But again, if you put that in your hand, if it's a poker hand, and you have that there, you have to be kind of strategic about when and how you'll use that. The big thing is that you feel going in that you've got something. You've got something to really work with. And if you get in a corner with this thing, if you're not moving the interview through, that's something that would be pretty powerful. And again, it has so many, circumstantially, it has so much information that lends to him being responsible for Kecia's death that it's extremely powerful in and of itself. It has a lot of power like that.
Now, back to this interview, I looked at the transcript, which you have put on the show notes. I could not find where you read Troy his Miranda rights. Was that not required? Had you already done that? Where does Miranda come in here?
Great question. That's what I love about doing this show, is that we can straighten up some things that are out there that people believe or may not be correct on. And you're right. First of all, the redacted version of that interview is transcribed and it's on the website. People can go kick around and look at how that flowed, because obviously we're not going to read that to people on this show. For sure, what we're looking at is with Miranda, it's required when two things are present, and it's no more than this, but there's so much out there that gets told that's not quite right. Is Miranda is required when a person is actually in the custody of the police and when they're being interrogated. And if one of those two things isn't there, then Miranda doesn't apply. And a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that it's just a carte blanche thing, that every time the police take somebody into custody, that they have to read their Miranda rights. And a lot of people, unfortunately, people that get arrested, to misunderstand that, will start hailing and screaming about that I'm going to sue, or they're going to drop the charge. And the thing is that, there's a lot of things you arrest people for that Miranda doesn't come into play. You don't have to ask them any questions. For example, if somebody was drunk in a public place or something like that. But in court, a good defense attorney will carefully analyze every bit of this to make sure that you met the requirements on that. Now, that said, here's why I didn't do it, is because Officer Ricky Lynn had done it. Ricky did it when he took him into custody out in the field, and Ricky, being the fantastic patrol officer that he was, carefully documented how he did it, where he was when he did it, what Troy's responses were, and the date and the time. He had all of that together to where when I heard that Troy was Mirandized, then I had a quick personal huddle with Ricky, because you really got to know this before you get all this. Again, this has to be accurate when you run with it. And Ricky confirmed everything to me about how he read his rights, how he responded and stuff like that. Now, Ricky didn't ask him any questions, which is fine too. But here's the end thing. You're only required to receive Miranda one time. And we're very careful about that. We'll find later in one of the following episodes that on appeal that was challenged a little bit, and we won that in the appeal court without any problem at all. But the reality of it is you get Miranda one time. It's not every time you sit down with a cop. So in this case, it wasn't read again.
Okay, so you go into the room with him. I'm assuming he's already there, right?
Correct.
Okay. Did Ricky put him there, or did you?
I can't recall. This has been several years ago. At the police department, we had holdover rooms, which were secure rooms that are something like a jail cell, no bars or anything like that, but they're little safe rooms where we can keep people from getting out or people getting in. That's important too. You have to have complete control over who's around that. And then also those little rooms, those holdover cells, as we called them, were very safe to where people really couldn't hurt themselves with them. For example, you couldn't take something and cut yourself. You couldn't hang yourself. Ironically enough, I watched a guy attempt to do that with a bootlace on a whole other case one time, but there's no place in there to hang something to actually get traction and do that. But so whatever happened is he was in one of those for a few minutes, and somebody walked him down to the interview him, and boy, it's been so long ago I can remember. I barely remember going in there, but I've got all these great notes. I think is what takes care of it.
So you go in there, and what's he doing?
He's just sitting there and looking at the floor, looking at me. There's nothing really earth-shattering about this. I don't think I've ever had a response from somebody in a room that was like, oh, wow. Kind of weird things every now and then as the interviews progressed, but they're basically just waiting. And keep in mind, they know why they're there. Even though if you haven't directly told them why they're there, sometimes they know why they're there. So they're just contemplating. So
you introduce yourself.
Yeah. And, the thing is that when you come in, it's real important. It's not like on TV. I had somebody ask one time if when you did this, it was like on TV. Do you yell and scream and throw things and turn chairs over? And you could if you were an idiot, but that's not how you get people to work with you. The whole thing is that you've got to build a rapport with people. I always would go in and use my first name. I'd introduce myself. I'd tell them who I was and what I did. That's fair and being up straight with that. And the whole thing is actually when you go in, your demeanor needs to be something more of a kind and relaxing demeanor, non-threatening and actually friendly. For example, do you need anything to drink? Do you need anything to eat? Are you cold? Are you hot? Or are you uncomfortable or anything like that? That's setting the ground to start building the basics of a quick rapport, which is mission critical in this. So if you look at the interview, you'll see it starts out pretty simple. But there's a reason for virtually everything. You're running a baseline with this person to get the communication going, and it starts with things as simple as, what is your name? What is actually your date of birth? Identification is going to come up and be very important. And if you look at the transcript on this one, there's a little discussion in the beginning too about kind of what you'll see what I'm ticking away is, do you have any emotional or mental health issues that are underlying and everything? And that's important because it's not likely that I would ever stop an interview on that, but I want a record of that for a lot of reasons. I want a record of it to show that I asked that so we all know when we get in court that that's on the table. And that could impact the approach that I take on this. I'm going to be more careful about certain things if somebody identifies that. I also talk a little bit about what his sobriety level might be. I want a record of that. And again, if somebody has some intoxication level, I'm not going to stop the interview, but I want a record that I asked, and I want a good, legitimate identification of that issue. And again, any one of us could route our interview in a different way based on that. But when I get in court, I want everybody to know that we've addressed that, and if they were intoxicated or believe they were intoxicated, I want a record of it. For example, I had a case where somebody in a suppression hearing, the defense was leaning on an intoxication defense on that. The statement may not be reliable. And the person was saying they were intoxicated. But, with the video that we had, what was great, because at one point in the interview, as he stood up like something off Karate Kid, like on one leg, and did a thing with his arms, perfectly balanced and everything. And that all is about making a record of who they are. You go into things like, are you right-handed or left-handed? Now, why do you think I might want to ask that in an interview?
Well, I think you might want to establish if there are wounds that you can tell were made with the right or left hand, that will lead more credence.
Exactly, because we don't have anything out of this scene yet. We don't have an autopsy. We have no real genuine cause of death yet on this. Is that, again, when you're sitting down with this guy, you have to keep an open mind to the idea that maybe this isn't a murder, but this is the importance of doing a structured interview with him. But yeah, you ask those basic things, not to see what hand they write with, but what if the scene, for example, has some cast off, or the medical examiner sees some patterns of injury that might support that or walk away from that. And then there's, we talk about employment and where have you worked and everything. Again, that's building rapport. kind of getting a feel for who this person is based on what they do or what they have done. And also in the background, too, at some point, as we'll learn, you do record checks on their employment. They could be alibis or not alibis. You want all that down. And then you work toward the family. Are you married? Are you single? Who are you married to? How long have you been married to? Do you have kids? Do you have stepkids? That's all in the interview. That's to get rapport. And actually, that's probably the first tick you make at getting in toward what happened to Kecia.
Well, I was going to ask you, has her name even been mentioned at this point?
No, it is at this point simply that, or were you married and who were you married to? You remember Detective Rob Wilson, I'm pretty sure he's the one that called it a dance. And that's kind of what happens at this point is that you get that baseline and you get that rapport started because that's so critical, and the dance starts. And that's where, when you move from that basic stuff, once you break the ice over the family and hear her name said, it's hard to describe this, but the next thing you want to work into is, can you get a timeline down for them, whoever's in that room? Well, what have you done? What's the last 24, 48, 72 hours look like? And for this, 72 hours and plus a little bit was pretty important. And while you're getting that, because it's important to get a statement on what they say they were doing, where they were at, and who they were with, and things like that, is the art, I think, in part of the dance is kind of start to include interactions with Kecia. Instead of just blurting out, when's the last time you saw Kecia? And what's the last time you said to Kecia? You want to go with this pretty easy and take it through and make it about them for a little bit and then weave Kecia into the conversation. And the whole time you're doing this dance, as Rob calls it, is when you're delivering information, because you're really good about asking about, well, did you ask this? Did you ask that? And what it comes down to is that you kind of offer things and watch for a minute and see how they respond. And then you may change your tactic, or okay, this is a hot button issue. I need to dress this up a little bit differently. So you're kind of poking in and poking out and watching for reactions to direct questions, because that's going to tell you when you're onto something and when you're not. Does that make sense?
It does. How was he responding when you were doing your poking or you're asking questions that were related to Kecia?
He was pretty laid back. I'm not going to say laid back, but he wasn't like aggravated, angry. He wasn't asking any questions about, is there any word on my wife? That's another thing that you'll see in a transcript. There's nothing that, well, how is she? Is she okay? And stuff like that. Because you remember when she was at the apartment telling the officers is that she's asleep. So, anybody else would be like, oh my God, I was pulling up. I went to the Rite Aid or whatever he would have said, but none of that's in this thing. So
he doesn't know, technically, why he's even there. No one has said, you're here because Kecia's dead.
No, I do. In the beginning, I told him it was a death investigation.
But did he ask you of whom?
No, see, there you go. Those are the things that you're kind of paying attention to, right? Is that there's no direct response, which could be they don't care, or there's an avoidance of that whole topic. That's what interviewing somebody is all about, is how fast can you get a rapport and work it out. And again, that whole thing of when you're tossing things at them, you're really watching for physical reactions, eye reactions, body changes, body shifts, body posture, all of that. I'll tell you, I've got a neat side story. I had a guy one time that I was interviewing over some robberies or something. And it was funny because once I got everything I needed, I noticed that every time I would hit him with direct questions about the material, I would watch and he would get like little cotton mouths on the edge of his mouth, like little builds up of white stuff. So when I was done, I just had to see if this was it, but I would hit him with a pertinent question and that would come, and then I'd walk him into something like, well, how old are your kids again, and everything, and it would go away. And then what I did is 3 or 4 times is I would take him back to a central question, and that cotton mouth was coming up. So, you're looking for a lot of things. Does their breathing change? Do you see the arteries in their neck start to pound? Do they start to furrow their brow? That's the kind of stuff you're looking for. And again, I think it's why Rob calls it a dance, is that you're kind of playing the music and you're seeing how they dance back to it.
Well, and I think also with most of us, if you're innocent, you're going to instantly start asking questions. Why am I here? You're talking about a death investigation. What are you even investigating that involves me? Why am I here with you? And I think the telltale sign would be if those questions aren't asked, that's kind of a red flag that he's not even concerned.
It's confirming for us. But then again, look at all the cases that you've seen interviews on where the guilty party can pretend all that stuff. So, there's no absolutes in that room. And, everybody that we've ever had the show will say over and over again, that's why you have to keep an open mind. This is a blank slate. You have ideas, but you can't lean in too hard with that. It's all about that. And again, at this time, we have a deceased woman. We don't even have a manner or a method of death or anything at this point. So it's you got to be very cautious on how you approach all these things. Your biggest thing you got to watch for is overleading people. And we've seen what that looks like in cases that didn't work out so well, is you've got to be careful because, again, everybody's going to be scrutinizing this interview if we get somebody in and headed to trial.
So you're casually asking him questions of various sorts. Kecia has not been mentioned at this point, right?
Right.
So what do you all continue to talk about? And at what point are you going to pull the rug out from under him and mention Kecia?
Well, it's not pull the rug out. I don't think I've ever seen that work. But as we continued to talk and as I kept laying things in to see how he'd respond, I started moving Kecia into the conversation and finding Kecia and finding her deceased. And then it gets a little more central into when were you with her. And then if you read the transcript is, he starts out just firmly, I've got nothing to do with it and deny it and everything. As you move, it's like you tighten that language a little bit at a time into moving from I need to know what happened to becoming more and more toward being accusatory. And again, I liked walking that in carefully because I didn't want to miss up opportunities. And when you read the transcript that you get, because what happens is that as we move through this interview, is he comes from denying it to moments when he's putting himself there in the room. And as far as an investigator, it's kind of like you're on the edge of the cliff. You're like, we're almost there. We're almost there. I think at one point I even told him, I said, you're only a few words from really straightening this out, that you're so close. And again, you got to be careful. I don't want to be accused later of taking somebody and walking them through and overfeeding them, because there is such thing as false confessions too.
So I'm guessing for our listeners who maybe haven't read the notes, you're talking about casual things, but you're starting to work that in. And that's, I guess he's knowing that you're indicating this death investigation is Kecia.
Oh, yeah.
So he's kind of putting himself there, kind of not. So he's not outwardly admitted to killing her or to saying, is my wife dead? No.
That didn't come until later in the interview. And I finally got him to a point where he finally made the admission that probably fortified everything, that our theories were based on that point, that he had been arguing with her. She had been talking about leaving. He talked about how that angered him. The more we learned about him, it was no surprise on that for who he was and how that angered him. And finally, at some point, because I was asking, I was telling him she's deceased, but, what happened? Did you, and again, being careful not to lead. And more importantly, we didn't know. Did you hit her? Did you strike her? Did you use a weapon on her? Did you use something other than your hand? And you're going through all those, you're laying all that out there to see if they pick and whatever. But again, you want the truth, or the closest thing to it. And he finally talked about that he struck her one time. And then he finally talked about how he actually strangled her.
So he comes clean with you and tells you that he's done this. I guess, are you kind of shocked at this point? Or did you kind of know that he's getting ready to tell?
Sometimes you can tell when they're moving to a point where they're likely to talk about this. It's never a guarantee. That's where you have to be the most careful, because you don't want to back them away from it. Because, in one more time, this is about looking for the truth, not necessarily looking for a confession. But when they do finally come across that, it's not over. Is you talk about it more, because then you got to move into getting details, or as detailed as you can, because even though they've just told you this, it still has to be corroborated by the scene and the evidence, and eventually by an autopsy. Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, I do. Now, let me ask, was he seeming remorseful or angry when he was talking about striking her and subsequently strangling her?
Angry at her in the moment. I didn't catch anything remorseful about him in the room at all. And I'm not going to say that he was happy he did it, but he seemed resolved that he did it. And he gave me the impression that he felt like this was 100% necessary, because he had thought that she was seeing somebody else. We'll learn later about more who his persona was, which is classic domestic violence abuser persona. I know at one point in the conversation with him when we were talking about it, and I think I asked something about, did you try to get help or anything like that, or did you stop? When you ask things like, did she say anything? And at one point he had stopped, and she evidently kind of begged for her life to some degree or something like that in the interview, and he went back at it. And at one point he said something to the effect of how he heard himself say, "Troy, you got to finish what you started." He had said, "I wanted to hug her, I wanted to make love with her and everything," and then he said that something told him, "Troy, you have to finish what you got started." And I said, "And how'd you do that?" And he goes, "I choked her." And then that was that. So at one point in the interview, about 3/4 through, I got the impression he was trying to feign a mental health condition, which you have to be aware of too, is that he looked at the doorway and was speaking to somebody while it was just me and him in the room. And I'm like, "Who are you talking to?" And he goes, oh, I thought that was my stepson. And I was like, okay. And I let that go. You don't contradict that, but it's like, I think part of him thought that I'm already in for a penny and for a pound. I might as well go ahead and start looking at maybe a mental health issue on this, which is not uncommon either.
Right.
And your goal, though, as a detective, is to document all of that, though, and have that on tape. And that's what we did with that.
So now, does he tell you that he left immediately after strangling her?
Yeah, he left the scene, and we'll get into that later about what his actions were, which were pretty interesting too. And when he talked about strangling her, what was unique about that is that again, not having anything going in, is that what that meant later was amazing, especially with regard to the autopsy findings.
Yeah. So what about that autopsy? What did that show her cause of death was?
Hey, there's more to the story, so go download the next episode like the true crime fan that you are.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. It is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, which is our website, and it has show notes for imagery and audio and video files related to the cases you're going to hear. We are also on Facebook, Instagram, Pinterest, LinkedIn, and YouTube, which has closed caption available for those that are hearing impaired. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. Subscribe to the Murder Police podcast and set your player to automatically download new episodes so you get the new ones as soon as they drop. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.